I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So for those who are following the text, we're up to page 274. So we just kind of we were just covering a section where Lama Tsongkhapa was like as he often does, he'll sort of explain something and then he'll address people's potential doubts or confusions. So we were in a section about that. And so in this particular like subsection, what Lama Tsongkhapa was pointing out is that on the one hand, the point he just made was that a couple points he made actually. One is that emptiness does exist, right? It's an existent phenomenon, right? Because sometimes there are like, and he was pointing out, because sometimes there are like, there are various ways people can misunderstand. Actually, I just want to remind you, there are various ways people can misunderstand, right? Because sometimes so for example, on the one hand, sometimes we'll say only emptiness. Some texts will say only emptiness is non-deceptive, and we're going to get into detail what that means. But some people took that to mean emptiness isn't empty, right? That emptiness is somehow truly existent, a thing that truly exists, and everything else doesn't truly exist. And one point Lama Tsongkhapa made in this section is that that's incorrect, right? Emptiness does exist, but it's not. How did I say it last time? It's the ultimate truth, but it's not ultimately existent, right? And there's a whole section in the Prajnaparamita Sutras that talks about the emptiness of emptiness. Right? So that emptiness itself is also empty of inherent existence. It doesn't exist intrinsically or independently, but it does exist. And then here, so now the section we're up to now in the middle of that page, it says, I'll read the heading because it explains it. Although emptiness exists, it need not be truly established. So that's what I was just saying. That eliminates the alleged contradiction with the scriptural passage from the praise of the sphere of reality. And we'll go ahead and read that passage, right? So the passage, the meaning of the scriptural passage from the praise of the sphere of reality too is as follows. In order to avert the apprehension of things as truly existent, right? That's meaning like grasping at a self, right? Of persons and of phenomena that we've been talking about, which is the root of all the other mental afflictions, right? So it's the root cause of all suffering, he's pointing out, right? So in order to avert that ignorance, which causes all of samsaric suffering, the sutras teaching emptiness, the absence of inherent establishment, teach that the referent object of that apprehension, right? Meaning the referent object of our grasping at a self, right? That truly is what he's talking about there is the object of negation, right? That the self-grasping grasps at a truly existent or inherently existent self, and he's saying that object doesn't exist at all, right? So the sutras teach that. And it says, they do not teach that emptiness does not exist, the naturally pure realm which negates the object of that apprehension of true existence, the two types of selves. So one point he's making here is emptiness exists, right? What is it? It's the lack of, if you find that object of negation, right, the truly existent self, the fact that that's non-existent actually is emptiness. Right? So emptiness exists in that sense. And what is emptiness? It's a negation, right? It's a negation, just like other, so anyway, it's a negation. So now he says, although emptiness exists, it is not truly established. So what does that mean, right? Actually, part of what we're getting at here is emptiness is the nature of a phenomenon, right? Like if we say, you know, like if Rajiv is grasping at an inherently existent I, which might happen sometimes, I'm not sure. Could be that he's an arhat and he's beyond that. But if Rajiv is still occasionally grasps at an inherently existent I, right? And then if one searches, we've been talking about this many times, right? But if one searches, if Rajiv were to search his own aggregates, right, his own mind and body, and discover there is no such I there, right? Then he would discover the emptiness of his own self, right? And he would discover that in a valid way, through reasoning, right? And he would actually have a valid perception of that. He would recognize that, wow, look, I don't have, that I that I was grasping at doesn't exist. So, and then that emptiness does exist, right? But that emptiness is not some intrinsically existent, separate phenomena, right? It's actually the nature of Rajiv. Does that make sense? It's the actual nature of how Rajiv exists. So it's not some intrinsically, truly established thing that exists solidly and independently. So that's what he's saying. That is why this scriptural passage serves as a source of refuting the propositions such as the emptiness that negates the object of negation, true existence, does not exist either, right? So it's saying, on the one hand, you can't say emptiness doesn't exist at all, right? And then he says, or it also refutes the proposition, in order to abandon all the mental afflictions, it is not necessary to realize emptiness, the ultimate suchness. Right, so it's that emptiness, and he's just saying what he said many times here, right? That we have to realize that emptiness in order to liberate ourselves from samsara. So emptiness does exist, but it's not truly established, is what he puts it. Then he says, you cannot avert the apprehension, the outline says, you cannot avert the apprehension of true existence by making a truly established reality your object of meditation. So now he actually quotes that same text, the praise of the sphere of reality, saying, impermanence, emptiness, and suffering, those three serve to cleanse the mind. The teaching that serves to cleanse it the best is the absence of inherent existence. And so I want to point out, you might not, if you read that, it may be unclear what it means. So there, in the, you all have heard the teachings on the Four Noble Truths. And so there's a more detailed exposition of the teaching on the Four Noble Truths called, where they talk about the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. And that's taught in many different places, actually, different sutras and so on. And so what this verse is getting at are the four, if you're going to study the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, then each of the four has 4 aspects. So therefore you get 16, right? 4 times 4. That's easy math, isn't it? So these are the 4 aspects of the truth of suffering. So in other words, impermanence, you see this list here, right? Impermanence, emptiness. So actually they're usually said in the order of impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and selflessness. Those are the 4 aspects of the truth of suffering. And what he's saying is, if you meditate here, right, he's saying these 3, so he's saying there are 3 aspects of the truth of suffering, right? One is, so what you would do if you were meditating on the truth of suffering, this is actually how you meditate on the truth of suffering, is you meditate on these 4 aspects. So one of them is impermanence, right? So if you recognize all things are impermanence, and if you contemplate deeply, it's not hard to figure out that impermanence is connected to suffering, right? We've all had that experience, probably. So if you haven't had that experience, you haven't been paying attention. And then contemplating suffering, and there are like lists. Earlier in this text, there's a list of the 8 types of suffering and the 3 types of suffering. So you're getting at understanding deeper and deeper levels of, of understanding the nature of suffering. And then emptiness. And in the first one, there's emptiness and there's selflessness. The first emptiness here refers to the lack, what do they call it, of a singular, permanent, independent self. It's not yet getting at the emptiness of an inherent existence. It's a grosser level of emptiness in that context.
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah. So there are this particular list of the 4 types of suffering, they mention emptiness and selflessness, and in this particular context, is because the words are used differently in different contexts, but in this context, the first one refers to like the lack of existence of a singular, permanent, independent self of persons, which they say is a grosser level. From the Prasangika Madhyamaka perspective, that's true, and there is a lack of that. That doesn't exist, a permanent, singular, independent self. But they're pointing out that's a gross level of emptiness. And so what it's saying here is if you meditate on those three aspects, it will purify your mind. It will benefit you. It'll calm your mental afflictions. It'll, if you meditate on impermanence, for example, we know that actually, right? If you start to meditate on impermanence, your attachment and so on decreases. If you start to recognize, some of your grasping relaxes, right? And so on. If you meditate on the truth of suffering, you start to recognize that, your whole process of getting caught up in things is problematic, and you start to develop renunciation, actually, right? Which is part of the path. But those don't fully liberate you from suffering, right? We know that. Right? Even if you realize that gross level of emptiness, that I just mentioned, that will benefit your mind humongously, but it won't completely cut off the root of suffering. Your suffering will return. So then he's saying, the teaching that serves to cleanse the best is the absence of inherent existence, right? Subtle emptiness, subtle selflessness. And he's saying you have to realize that if you really want to cut off the root of suffering. And when you understand that, you truly understand the nature of suffering, the first noble truth. Does that make sense? That's what that verse is saying. So then he says, he quotes again, the lack of inherent existence of dharmas, meditate on it as the expanse of reality, or the dharma dhatu. So he's saying that should be if you want to achieve liberation from suffering, that should be your main object of meditation, right? And that's the main thing that cuts the root of samsara. He says, the fact that these phenomena lack an inherently established inherent existence is said to be the expanse of reality, which is the object of meditation. And just meditation on that is said to be the best purifier of the mind. So that's clear, right? And he said that before, hasn't he? That you have to meditate on emptiness to achieve liberation from samsara. And now he goes a little further. He says, therefore, how could it be suitable to interpret this as the position that the emptiness, that is the absence of inherent establishment of phenomena appearing inherently established, is a nihilistic emptiness, and that therefore a truly established emptiness separate from it should be posited as the emptiness that is the object of meditation. Then he says, that is like propounding that when it comes to eliminating the fear arising from the apprehension of a snake in the east, even though there is no snake in the east, showing that person that there's no snake in the east will not serve as the antidote, but rather one needs to show that there is a tree in the west. Which is a very interesting metaphor, right? But you get his point there, right? So he's saying, he's going back to what he was saying earlier, right? You have to identify the object of negation, right? And you have to, through reasoning, eliminate that object of negation. Right there, right? Where you were grasping before. And he's saying, some people assert that there's this idea that there's like that's why he's using this phrase, he's saying this phrase, the expanse of reality, the dharma dhatu, right? Or sometimes they say the dharmakaya, they have different synonyms, but here he says dharma dhatu. And he's saying sometimes some people, some Buddhists actually, sort of have this assertion that the dharma dhatu is something other than negating that self you're grasping at right in your heart, right? It's some other thing that sort of exists in some ethereal way, out there way, or that is something different than that. And he's saying, if the cause of suffering is your self-grasping, right? So if the wisdom understanding emptiness doesn't negate that, it's not eliminating the cause of your suffering, right? And that's where he's giving this metaphor. He's saying, like, it's like if you're afraid of the snake, right? The snake being the cause of suffering, right? The thing that you're afraid of, the thing that's going to cause you pain, right? Which is right here. He's saying, it's not going to help that person if you say, oh, there's don't be afraid of the snake over here, there's a tree over there, right? Actually, snakes sometimes are up in trees, aren't they? So even that won't give you relief. You can climb the tree and there could be a snake up there. Anyway, that was a tangent. But you get the point he's getting at? He's saying, so don't think emptiness is some other... One point he's saying is don't think emptiness is something other than the negation of the true grasping at the self that you yourself, innately are doing. And also he's saying, don't think of emptiness as some truly existent, independent thing that exists over there, or on its own, in some separate way, because that's not going to help you with your problem, right, which is self-grasping. Does that make sense? So he's saying some people propound that sort of view or express that kind of view, and he's saying, don't follow that, or you'll waste your time. You won't become free from suffering. So he basically says that. He says, this is because one would propound that when it comes to eliminating the suffering of sentient beings as they adhere to true existence, with regard to what appears to be truly existent to us, right, to them, the realization that the basis with regard to which this apprehension or true existence lacks true existence will not serve as an antidote, but rather one needs to show them some other useless basis to be truly existent, right? So he's just saying the same thing, right? He's saying, the cause of our suffering is right there. It's our own way of perceiving things wrongly, right? And saying, oh, there's some other truly existent thing that, actually, one point, he said it very clearly, so I'm not going to add anything really, but just another perspective on this, is I kind of like this point that Bob Thurman sometimes makes a point about this point about emptiness, where he says, actually, people who have this idea that emptiness is some, as he puts it, some other useless basis that's a truly existent thing, actually what they have is a kind of escapist fantasy, right? Or is it, actually it's some kind of like unconscious escapist fantasy that you can somehow get away from. It's actually like, really, it's, first of all, it actually lacks compassion in some sense, right? It's some idea of like, I'm just going to escape from everybody else and go to some other truly existent place. That's emptiness. And it's also sort of escaping from, it's like an escapist fantasy as if you can escape from your own experience, right? And your own, and I guess what this text is getting at is, what we have to do is understand, actually you said it earlier, right? Nirvana is understanding the nature of samsara, right? Earlier in the text, I think last time I quoted that, it's in here, right? Understanding the ultimate nature of samsara is nirvana. Nirvana is not some other place. It's not some, actually there was a quote, I think it was Emerson said, heaven is not some spiritual roof garden. It's a similar point. In other words, I think that was Emerson, it's not Buddhist, but he was making a similar point here, right? There's not some escapist place to go to in this sense, right? Yeah.
Is he arguing against the concept of pure land?
Not exactly, in the sense that really, like, if you think of because Lama Tsongkhapa would say there is such a thing as pure lands, but in a sense, I sometimes think the way to view what a pure land is, though, it's not some escapist place either. Actually, I think a way to view a pure land is it's like a university for one's heart or something, for one's bodhichitta. That a pure land is not a place you ultimately escape to. Actually, like a pure land is a place that if you're confused and unable to help others, then the Buddha created a place to learn so you can come back and help others. It's like somebody, well actually you did, it's like somebody who wants to help others but needs to go to med school for a while. So they go off to med school and spend however long there,
Illusion.
in order to then come back and help people who are sick, right?
Yeah.
The correct, I think, view of a pure land is not that some place that you go to escape ultimately.
So it's more of an intermediate.
Yeah, pure land is an intermediate place.
The ultimate is the parinirvana.
Yeah, the ultimate is that if you think of what a Buddha is, right? The ultimate state is a state that, like the Buddha's, in a sense, the Buddha's body and mind are present everywhere. Actually, as the Buddha doesn't escape. The Buddha's empathically and compassionately present to all sentient beings. So the Buddha is not in some alternate realm where they escaped from suffering in that sense. The Buddha escaped from suffering as they overcame all their self-grasping, all their obstacles, and accumulated all the positive qualities. But the Buddha is not like in some other place, in a sense. I mean, they would say because the Buddha is omniscient, they would say, so the Buddha's mind pervades all phenomena. So the Buddha is not somewhere else. So you could say that the Pure Land...
He isn't. Like immanent and transcendent.
Yeah, I mean, he's transcendent in the sense that he's not suffering, and he's, anyway, yeah, that's right. But to go back to so Pure Land would be a place where like actually, I have a friend who went to his teacher actually. That was an interesting point, and he said like, well, should I pray? He was getting, he's older than me, and he was saying that he went, well, it's the same thing though, but he went to his teacher and he said, should I pray to come back to this planet? Like in my prayers, my dedication of merit, should I pray to come back to this planet and try to study with you again? And his teacher kind of looked at him and said, in your case, that might go astray. Like you might get lost. You might not find the path again. And he said, better if you go to a Pure Land. It's a safer bet for you, like to go study there. Then you'll come back, kind of thing, after you've progressed in the path. Then you'll come back to help others, and you'll be more, it's like, so better to go someplace safer for now, kind of thing. But it's not some ultimate place, in a sense. That's the important part. The Pure Land is not some ultimate, because actually if you think of what's a bodhisattva is somebody who wants to help others, right? So the Pure Land is filled with bodhisattvas, right? So if they were to say, oh wow, now I'm in the Pure Land, I'm just going to bliss out here, well then they actually wouldn't be bodhisattvas, would they? If they're there to make progress on the path so that they can then more effectively help others, that makes some sense then, doesn't it? So I think that's the correct way to view it, is it's like a training ground, a place for bodhisattvas or for trainees to go who are not yet, who might lose the path. So that's, in a sense, that's what compassionately you can see. And actually, last point I'll make actually is, so that's kind of the idea of what a Pure Land is. But then, actually, just the other day I was reading, where was it? Oh, it was in a text by Khedrubje, Lama Tsongkhapa's, one of his two main disciples. And he pointed out, he said, he was saying, I mean, he didn't say it this way, but he basically said, this is, Shakyamuni Buddha, this is his Pure Land. That we're in a Pure Land, in a sense, already, if you know how to see it that way. If you think of a Pure Land as a place to train in the path, well, this is the place Shakyamuni set up. And he set up a more dangerous, and in a sense, he set up a wilder, more dangerous place, but a place that they call it sometimes, what is it? They have different words for it, but like, what's the word? They sometimes call it like, I don't know how that, I can't remember the exact translation, but something like, this planet is a planet of struggle. They actually said that, right? When there was a Buddha before who was looking around, and they were like saying to bodhisattvas, oh, who will help these beings? And then like in a future time, these beings will be very, they'll be very ethereal, and they'll be very peaceful, and who will help them? And bodhisattvas were volunteering. And then that Buddha said, who will help those beings? And described the earth at this time. And everybody kind of, like you do in school when you hide behind your paper or something, like all the bodhisattvas are kind of like, oh, let me check my clock. Actually, and then it was Shakyamuni Buddha who raised his hand and said, I'll go to that universe, and I'll make that the place where I lead beings to enlightenment. So in a sense, this is his Pure Land, but it's a different kind. They say like, what's the word? Amitabha's Pure Land has like lotuses everywhere, and pools where, if you want it to be cooler, it's suddenly cooler. If you want it to be warmer, it's suddenly warmer. And the earth is made of kind of very soft jewels that don't hurt your feet, but are kind of crystalline and beautiful to see. And, but actually they say that, one last thing I'll say is, I think it's interesting, I always remember this, that the first Panchen Lama, Losing Choki Gelten, who I very much think is a wonderful teacher, he was the teacher of the fifth Dalai Lama, he said, there are beings, and like Amitabha's Pure Land is this, they call it Sukhavati. Sukha means bliss, right? So the blissful land. That's why. So it has like the ponds and the lotuses. And
Is it the author of the Easy Way?
Yeah. The first Panchen Lama is author of the Easy Path. Yeah.
Easy Path.
Easy Path. Yeah. And he said, same meaning though. And he said, there are particularly compassionate bodhisattvas in Sukhavati, Amitabha's Pure Land, who are praying to be reborn on this earth because they can progress faster. Mm-hmm. Whereas that's a place where you don't fall backwards. You only progress because it's very peaceful, and you're surrounded by Buddhas, and they're always teaching. So you make progress, but he said, but there, the progress is slower. So they pray, may I go to this planet? May I die and be reborn on the earth so that I'll progress faster to help others faster. So in one sense, this is a great Pure Land. In another sense, it's a harder one.
Yeah, the Lotus Sutra points that out literally. He quotes Buddha saying, this is Pure Land.
Yeah.
I don't remember which chapter.
Yeah. It's very, so anyway, so you get the idea here. So emptiness is not some escapist place. and it's also not truly existent in the sense of like some kind of inherently existent thing, and it's also not separate from. It actually has to. It's only Dalai Lama often points this out. The whole point of emptiness is it has to directly contradict ignorance, right? So in other words, that's the point, right? Our ignorance grasps at the self, right? So emptiness has to be a negation of that. And so it's saying, and that's another way of saying it, right? So we're always grasping at the self, and that's how we then give rise to jealousy and pride and anger and hatred and craving and addiction and all these different things, right? Is out of this grasping at our own self. And so wisdom has to directly contradict that, right, in order to eliminate it. And just saying emptiness is some other thing over there, right, that's truly existent, isn't going to contradict that, right? Actually, then subtly, right, if you think of emptiness as some truly existent thing, there's going to be some subtle sense of an I that wants to get that, right? It's another object then, right, that's out there somewhere that I want to have and own. So that's not going to contradict ignorance. It's actually going to subtly play into ignorance, right? There's going to be an I that wants to own that other thing, or possess it, or unify with it, right? Make love to it in some metaphorical sense, or whatever. None of that's going to work, right? It has to directly contradict ignorance. Okay. So then comes, oh, what's that?
No tree in the west.
Yeah, no tree in the west. Okay, so now comes the next section. And this section is a long section, actually. It's actually one of the, after this next, it's called the Presentation of Conventional and Ultimate Truths. It actually covers, it's like, I was looking, most of the rest of the text is this section, actually. But it'll take a while because it's complicated. In one way, I was thinking about this, I wanted to make a little just a preliminary statement. In one sense, we always talk, actually, if you study Buddhism, then we often talk about conventional truth and ultimate truth. All of you have heard that phrase, I've used it, right? And actually, I was thinking about this, like, if you use that in a superficial sense, like it's kind of easy to understand, right? Ultimate truth is empty, you could say, like, what's ultimate truth? It's emptiness, right? Conventional truth is the appearing phenomenon. And if you just leave it at that, it seems very straightforward. But then if you start to actually analyze more deeply, which Lama Tsongkhapa is about to do, what does that actually mean? What is conventional truth? What is ultimate truth? How does one really understand them? Then it gets very difficult to understand. But then if you understand that, but actually, and this is what I want to make. One is, you're going to see this as we go along, and I'll try to make it as clear as I can, but I'm basing this on my own experience. It's easy to misunderstand this. As you go deeply into what's the nature of conventional truth, what's the nature of ultimate truth, it's easy to misunderstand these points. Partly because the language is very tricky, and so we're going to try to be careful about the language. Like he gets into this thing, you'll see in a little while, like there's between like conventional truth and existing conventionally, and mere convention. So there are all these like subtle distinctions linguistically, which we're trying to use English words for. So anyway, it can be a little tricky. It's only Dalai Lama when he commented on it, he said, I was reading the commentary, to prepare, right? And it's only said, so conventional truth is not the same as conventional weapons. He said, like, there's conventional weapons and then there's nuclear weapons. He said, that's not, he's like, the word conventional has a lot of different meanings in English. And he was like saying, I know that, but this is not, he said, like, we have to be careful what the meaning is. We're not talking about, it's not like conventional weapons. He was making a joke, but. So I want to say, like, just almost like a warning that one point is, it'd be easy to misunderstand, so we'll try to be careful together. That's one point, because it's like, it's a challenging topic. Another is, though, it's quite useful, because if you can understand this, then your understanding of emptiness will be better. That's the point, right? And then, I guess one other point I'll make is just from my own side, like, so to prepare for this, I was reading, there are like 2 commentaries I mainly read, but then I was reading another book that covers the same topic by Kendrikje, Lama Tsongkhapa's disciple. And as I was reading that book over, there were many times where I would I'd be like, I don't understand this. Oh, now I understand it. And then I would turn the page and I would go back, no, what did I just understand? My point is that it takes repetition. And it takes going over it from different angles, and then eventually it becomes clearer. So I just want to warn you, it seems a little confusing at first. But it starts off easy. So it says, the basis from which the true truths are divided. So he says, earlier scholars had many ways of asserting the basis of the division of the 2 truths. However, here, objective knowledge are the basis of divisions. And then I'll read the quote. From the Compendium of Trainings, it says, objects of knowledge are also exhausted as these, conventional and ultimate truth. So what's he saying there? He's saying, object of knowledge and existent, in Buddhism, an object of knowledge and an existent phenomenon are synonyms. Does that make sense? If something exists, that means it's an object of knowledge. It's a potential. You could say it's something that can be known, right? In other words, if something is existent, that means it can be perceived. Those are synonyms in Buddhist philosophy. So he's saying, what is the basis on which we, so for example, in this room, if you were to say, if we were to say, I'm going to categorize male and female based on the people in this room, right? So the people in this room would be the basis, and the categorization would be either male or female. It could be other, non-binary, or then you'd have to sort of say there are three categories. Here he's saying there are only two categories in this sort of analysis, conventional and ultimate. And what's the basis on which we're going to analyze that? All phenomena, all objects of knowledge. So that's the basis. Does that make sense? That's just what he means by basis. So it means he's not only talking about certain things, all things are included in this. That's one point. Then he says, according to the fundamental treatise in the Middle Way, which is by Nagarjuna, worldly conventional truths and ultimate truths are objects of knowledge are divided into two, conventional and ultimate. So that's what he's saying. There's no third category in this sense. Everything that exists can be described as either a conventional truth or an ultimate truth. Now, the meaning of dividing them in that way. The two that are divided into two must be different. So in what way are they different? Now it starts to get a little, the first part was easy, right? We're talking about all phenomena, and there's only two categories. That's pretty straightforward. Now we'll start to get a little more. Now we're going to start edging into the water a little bit deeper. Somebody will say it. I'll actually read it to see if people can understand it when we read it, and I'll explain. It says, in this regard, there are three types of difference. A pot and a woolen cloth, for example, are different entities. Product and impermanent, for instance, are one entity and different isolates. With these two types, the constituting causes of the difference are both functioning things. When either is not a functioning thing, the difference is a difference that negates their being one. Many earlier scholars propounded that the two truths were different in that their being one was negated. On the other hand, some asserted that the two were one entity and different isolates. So probably I want to just read that, say, like, if you just read that once over, does anybody understand it? I'd be surprised if we did. So that's okay. That's why I read it. I was like, kind of curious. Somebody said, "Oh, that's totally clear." The meaning immediately appears to my mind.
Are you reading from page 277?
275, the very bottom. The very bottom of 275. That was the last paragraph on 275. So what he's getting at is, we just said there's a division of two things, right? Conventional truths and ultimate truths. So now he's trying to get into it, he's getting a little more philosophical, right? So he's saying, okay, when we say two things, right? He's saying there are different ways that we can talk about what does two things mean, right? One way of talking about two things, and he uses the example here of a pot and a woolen cloth, right? A pot is made of, let's say, like, I don't know, my house, metal. I used a metal pot last night. And a woolen cloth, when you look at those, they're obviously two separate things, and they're different entities, right? One is made of wool, it's woven, it's soft, and so on. It dries things. The other is metal, and and they're, they came from different places. They're not. No one ever thinks they're one entity, right? They're two separate objects. So sometimes when we say two separate things, we mean that, right? Like two separate, like the lamp and the chair, right? They're clearly separate entities or separate phenomena, you could say. That's one way of talking about two separate things. But then he's saying there's another way to talk about two separate things, two different things, where they're one entity. And here he said one entity but different isolate. And what that means, I think sometimes, I like that translation, I think it's a good translation, but you have to kind of contemplate what it means. And what it means is that it's not a separate entity, but you can, conceptually isolate different aspects of that thing. So I want to give an example. Like, if someone, like, let's say, if I were to say, like, such and such person, right? is a mother and also a soldier. Like, so let's say she's in the military, right? She's an army soldier, right? Like, right? So there, it's, you know, I'm not talking about two separate people though, right? In this case, I'm talking about one person who, when she's at her house, she plays the role of her mother, right? When she goes, whatever, when she's out at her job, she's playing the role of a soldier. But you can't say those are two separate entities, right? It's the same basis, the same person. But you can certainly conceptually isolate, right? Like, in other words, if you couldn't conceptually isolate those two different roles, then, you know, then the general would be treating her like a mom, and her children would be treating her like a soldier. It would be quite confusing, right? Does that make sense? So, you know, so anything, and here he gives the example, a product and impermanent, right? So what he's saying is like this is this microphone, right? On the one hand, we can relate to it. One way of conceptually looking at it is it makes sound, you know, helps us make sound louder, right? But then another way of looking at the microphone is it's impermanent, right? It changes instant by instant, right? It's made up of molecules, and it's, you know, and they're, what do you call it? There are atoms, and there are, what do you call it? Electrons moving and so on, right? If we analyze it that way, right, that's true. In other words, they're both valid points, right? This is a microphone, it amplifies sound, and also it's made up of atomic structures that are changing, and we know that conceptually, right, if you think about it. So both are true of this, so it's not two separate entities then, right? It's one entity, but you can conceptually isolate different aspects of it. Does that make sense? So that's true and one can, so he gave that example, product and impermanent. This is a product, right, it's a microphone. This also happens to be impermanent, so it's made up of ever-changing parts, right, atoms, you could say. And so so now you understand, so he's getting at, there are different ways to talk about the meaning. So he's actually, what he's saying is, he's basically, you could say this, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, I just said there are two, right? But what does two mean in this context? Am I talking about two separate entities, like a woolen cloth and a pot? Or am I talking about one entity that has two different isolates, right? Like the microphone, or like the mother who's a soldier, you know, that kind of thing. Does that make sense now? Mm-hmm. And he's saying, when I look back, he's saying here, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, when I look back at earlier scholars, you can find texts, he's saying he could find texts in which they said different things. They disagreed with each other about what does it mean, the two truths, right? So he says, some said the two truths were different in that their being one was negated. So he's saying that they were different entities, right? He's saying some scholars thought, and actually somebody who thinks that emptiness is a thing that's out there, truly existent, would have to believe that the ultimate, that person would have to believe the ultimate is one entity, right, that exists by itself, and then conventional phenomena are another entity that exists apart from that. Does that make sense? If you really thought this kind of person he was talking about earlier, who thinks emptiness is some truly existent thing that's not the negation of self-grasping, then you would be asserting some idea that there are two different entities. That emptiness is some kind of truly existent thing, and then people are some kind of truly existent thing, and they're somehow separate. He's saying that's wrong. Does that make sense here? So he's saying the meaning, so what he's getting at, what he says, really, when we talk about the two truths, they're one entity, but different isolates. So he's saying, like the soldier who's also a mother, or like the microphone that also is impermanent, made up of atomic structures that are changing. So he's saying here, he's saying the two truths are two things, in the sense, but they're of one entity, right? It means they're like, so for, and anyway, maybe I won't go further because he's going to say it, so I won't say it. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe I missed it, but what's the third type of difference? Did we get to that, or?
I'm trying to see where,
Confuse me.
here he said, let's see, so one is different entities, second is one entity and different isolates, but these two types of company. Okay, I think the third one, I think he's subdivided. I think, at least the way I read it, let me double check. I think what he's doing is he's subdividing the second category. So the first one would be two different entities. The second one would be one entity with different isolates where both are functioning things. So that'd be like the example I gave of a mother who's also a soldier. They're both functioning what's the word, produced phenomena, using the term I used earlier when we were in another class. We were talking about. And then another one would be one entity with different isolates, where one is a functioning thing, like yourself, for example, and the other is a unproduced phenomena, or you could say a non-functioning thing means an unproduced phenomena, like your emptiness. Right? So in reality, it would be that third then. Does that make sense? It's one entity with different isolates, but they're not both. Remember we used to have that whole section on produced phenomena and unproduced phenomena? That emptiness is we went through a whole thing where the unproduced were like emptiness, space, cessations, and so on. We had a whole section on that. But anyway, in this case, the third category I think would be where it would be a subdivision of one entity with different isolates. But in this case, it would be where if you think about what is the meaning of emptiness here, right? It's that. Well, actually, it's an interesting point.
What, can you argue that that this is the third type of difference? It's very subtly close to not being right. That different in that phenomena are apparent, but different in that it's a non-functioning. Actually, their nature is this emptiness.
The tricky part, actually, I'll get into this in a minute, is that also unproduced phenomena. Then it would be actually it's possible. I guess when I think about it, I oversimplified it, isn't it? Because in the case of produced phenomena or functioning things or something, so we'll call them produced phenomena because that's the term I used before. Then the emptiness of that, if you think about the emptiness of that, they would be a produced phenomena and an unproduced phenomena that are on the same entity. Mm-hmm. But then if you think of the emptiness of space, right, which is also empty, we covered that previously, then it would be an unproduced phenomena and an unproduced phenomena. Because space is unproduced and emptiness is unproduced. So then it would be two unproduced phenomena that are of one entity but different isolates. If that was clear, I don't know. I mean, I actually said it correctly, but I'm not sure if that was understandable.
I followed, but it's...
Yeah, that's what I mean. That was the experience I had that's what I was saying when I was reading Cambridge. I was like, oh, that's really clear. What did you just say? But that's a good sign. Actually, I think that's how we study this kind of topic. Is that you have to kind of keep doing that until eventually it's like, because it's quite, that should be the experience, I think, for most of us. For me, it is. And then through familiarity, one starts to get it a little better. But yeah, so I think the second type. But anyway, the third one has to be so the one is different entities, and then he starts to get into more of this on the next page. When you're getting into one entity with different isolates, that's what I was starting to say. There are different ways to subdivide that, because it can be a produced phenomena and an unproduced, and an unproduced that are one entity but different isolates, or it could be two unproduced that are, or it could be two produced, right? Like the woman who's a mother and a soldier. They're both produced phenomena. Anyway, so there are different ways to subdivide that, but I think we're getting that's too complicated. We don't need to get into that level of detail. Okay, so now he says, in the relation on page 276 at the top, he says, the relation of essential identity. That means one entity. Here he's just using another term, but now he's talking about one entity, right? So the relation of one entity is fine according to the illumination of the middle way, which says it is not contradictory even for non-functioning things. Therefore, the oneness of entity and different isolates is not contradictory even if both constituting causes of the difference are non-functioning things, or if either of them is. So he's just saying what I just said. Or is that it could be one entity and different isolates, in the sense that what he's really getting at, if we go back to emptiness, right, is that functioning things like persons are empty of inherent existence, but also non-functioning things like space or even emptiness are empty of inherent existence. And so we have to be able to understand that any of those kind of phenomena can be empty, and it can still be, and it's not. But in any of those cases, the emptiness of that thing is not some other thing, right? It's the same entity. It's the nature. And another way of saying that is, just to put it back to ourselves, right? That your emptiness, my emptiness, the emptiness of yourself is not something other than you. Does that make sense? That would be one way of saying it. It's the very nature of who you are. It's the ultimate nature of who you are. It's your deepest nature, you could say. And so that's what he's getting at here when he says it's not some other. It's one entity. It's not something other than you. It's the nature of you, actually. Just like your impermanence. Another way of saying it is like, if you were to say, like we all know you're impermanent, right? Like right this moment, we don't always think of this, right? But I'm going to use impermanence as the example for a second, just to make it clear. like, we're not ordinarily thinking this, but if you actually start to analyze it, right, you feel solid, somewhat, right? But then if you analyze it, right, there's blood coursing through your veins, there are neurons firing, there are cells that are doing all kinds of, right, like different activities. Within those cells, they're made up of atoms that have, nuclei and electrons and all that. So there are many levels on which, like the level of impermanence that's true of your own body, right, is it's utterly impermanent, right? Nothing is stable for even a second, right? If you speak of atoms, even, right? And that impermanence is not separate from your body, it's the nature of your body. Does that make sense? Like you can't say, oh, the impermanence of my body is something other than that, right? It's that when you analyze what is, like this body may feel solid, like if I'm in a certain mood, I could feel like very solid, right? But then if I start to analyze, well, this body's very nature is there's blood, there's cells, there's all these different levels and levels of impermanence, right? You get down to string theory, which I don't really understand, and still it would be impermanent, right? So the more deeply you analyze, the more you find impermanence of your body, right? But that impermanence is not something separate from your body, it's the nature of your body. Does that make sense? So it's one entity with your body. You could conceptually think about it as, wow, that's the nature of my body. So you could isolate, that's what it means by isolate. You could conceptually isolate or think about it and recognize it. And it's the nature of your body. So the same thing with emptiness. Emptiness is not, in the same way that your impermanence of your body is the nature of your body, another conceptual way of looking at your body is you analyze its ultimate nature, and you find the emptiness there. But again, that's not something separate from your body, it's the nature of your body, just like the impermanence was. Does that make sense? So that's the meaning of one entity with a different isolate in relation to yourself.
How is that different from when we were discussing phenomena? Or is that the same?
Say again.
When we were discussing phenomena, the types of, like when we broke down, but it's either broken down by parts, or that you can break down moment to moment.
Mhm.
Is that, are we talking about the same thing or different?
So we were talking about that. So you're asking if that's the same thing? I know, I remember what you're talking about. It's the same as talking about one entity and different isolate.
Yeah, this is just looking at it from a different perspective, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same, yes, I mean, we're talking about the same thing in general. It's just this is a particular way of recognizing that when you're going to analyze the nature of two truths, you would understand that that the second truth is not a separate, that it's not separate from those parts, you could say also. Yeah, so it'll be the same thing then. So then he continues on. Thus, with regard to the entity, each and every object, there is both a conventional and an ultimate entity. If the two truths were not one entity, since it would be very unreasonable for them to be different entities, they would be without entity and therefore non-existent. Because whatever exists necessarily exists is either one or many. Is either one entity or many entities. Anyways, it's pretty straightforward, right? He's just saying the same thing again. So each and every object, so what he's getting at though is every object, just to repeat what he said there, because it's important for later, every single object has its own conventional nature and its ultimate nature. Any existent phenomena, or any basis, let's call it that. Is that the term he used there? With regard to the entity, each and every object, so we can say that, each and every object has its conventional nature and its ultimate nature. And we'll get into more what those mean, so that's the whole section. So. Then he quotes Nagarjuna's essay on the mind of enlightenment. Conventions are explained as emptiness. Emptiness is only the conventional. For surely this does not occur without that, just like product and impermanence. Right? So he's saying the same thing. In other words, actually, doesn't that sound a bit similar to the Heart Sutra? The Heart Sutra, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Right, that's getting at the same point, actually. Right, if you study the Heart Sutra, where Buddha says, right, form is emptiness, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form. Form also is not other than emptiness. In a sense, what's the Buddha saying there? He's saying what this is saying, that like form is conventional, right? Emptiness is an ultimate truth, right? And when he says form is emptiness, emptiness is form, he's not saying, on the one hand, he's not saying they're there's no difference, you know, that you can't conceptually differentiate them. He's using different words for them, right? But that they're the same entity, right? That's why he says, therefore form is not other than emptiness, right? He's saying it's not some other thing than the nature of form, right? And emptiness is not other than form. Form also is not other than emptiness, right? That they're not two separate entities.
So, Dr. we could apply the dependent origination right into conventional and ultimate, just like we do that.
Yeah, ultimately the meaning of this is dependent origination, that's right. And do you see why he's emphasizing this point, though? Part of why he's emphasizing this point is that sometimes people make up a wrong idea. And he's saying even Buddhist masters, that's what he said. Even some Buddhist masters made up this wrong idea that emptiness is some truly existent thing apart from the nature, being the nature of phenomena. And he's saying so he's clarifying this in various ways just to make it clear for us that if you start to get some idea when you're meditating on emptiness that it's something other than the nature of the conventional, that you've gone astray. Does that make sense? So it's quite useful in that sense. And now he just gives an example. He says, if a sprout, for instance, were a different entity from its own ultimate entity, it would also be a different entity from its emptiness of true existence. So the sprout would be truly established. Therefore, since it is not a different entity, it is one entity. Although a sprout is empty of its own true existence, it is not its own ultimate truth. Again, these are quite challenging, aren't they, passages? But I'll go through that one, because I think it's useful. So one point he's making, right, is, it's actually quite interesting. He's saying, if you had a sprout, right, and it were a completely different entity from its emptiness, then you would have to say the sprout is inherently existent, and its emptiness is inherently existent, right? Which is the exact opposite of what we're saying, actually, isn't it? That's one problem. But then he also says, and then he makes this last line I think is quite intriguing. He says, although a sprout is empty of its own true existence, it is not its own ultimate truth. Actually, the problem there is if you were to say, in other words, if you say the ultimate nature of a sprout is emptiness, that's correct, right? But sometimes if you were to say this, if you were to say a sprout is emptiness, that would be problematic, right? Because I saw the sprout, but I didn't see its emptiness, right? So if you didn't recognize that they're different conceptual isolates, as he calls them, that they're different, that just like I could see a person, right? Like if I look up and see Rebecca, right, I don't necessarily see her impermanence, right? Her impermanence exists, but I may not see it. Does that make sense? If one sees that impermanence, that changes, actually for oneself, that changes one's experience, doesn't it? And so in the same way, right, like if I were to say, using Rebecca, right, if I were to say Rebecca is empty of inherent existence, that's correct, right? But it would take a lot of reasoning to realize that, right? But if you were to say Rebecca is emptiness, well then, then all Cynthia would have to do is turn to her left, and she'd become enlightened, right? Because she would see emptiness. Does that make sense? So he's being careful about the words there, right? Because we have to understand correctly, phenomena are empty, but they're not emptiness, right? Because if they were emptiness, then just seeing them, you would realize emptiness. You would see when I see a phenomena directly, I would be seeing emptiness directly, and then I'd be enlightened already. That's not the case, is it? But the ultimate nature of that phenomena is emptiness, right? So it's not a separate entity. It's one entity with it. It's its nature, right? It's the ultimate nature of that phenomena, but it's not. But it's not identical to that phenomenon in the sense that just seeing that phenomena, you don't necessarily realize its emptiness. You have to practice in order to realize its emptiness. Okay. A few texts set forth that the two truths are neither one nor different. Some of them are referring to inherent. Okay, anyway, that's. I'll just read it. He says a few texts set forth that the two truths are neither one nor different. Some of them are referring to inherently established oneness and difference, whereas others are referring to there not being different entities or one isolate. Anyway, I don't know if that one's not. That's not essential, but in a sense, he's just saying sometimes you'll see in a book, in some books, they'll say the two truths are neither one nor different, and he's saying you have to understand the meaning of that, right? One way of understanding, in some texts, the meaning of that is they're not one in the sense that they're not the same isolate, right? But they're not different in the sense they're not different entities. So it's just saying what we've been talking about. That's probably the most useful one. The others are talking about the emptiness of the two truths, which is we won't get into now. Good
Yeah,
question or
if I
comment?
can take a minute, to think together or to make sure I understand correctly.
Mhm.
So if you think about the emptiness of phenomena, and emptiness of self, emptiness of this, emptiness of that, and so on. And this might have been discussed before, but I want to make sure I understand correctly and follow. So the emptiness that, okay, emptiness of this, emptiness of that, emptiness of self, emptiness of other. So there's the emptiness depends on this and depends on that and depends on self, right? There's no, like, they don't share the same emptiness.
Yeah.
It all depends on the object.
Yeah,
So,
that's right.
yeah.
Yeah, they sometimes say the emptiness of each phenomena, like, they sometimes say, so some texts even say like they have the same taste or something. It means like, you know, but yeah, you can't say the emptiness, like the emptiness of, right, the emptiness of a person doesn't exist independent of that person. You're right, so that's what you're saying. Yeah, that's right.
And the emptinesses are different in nature. So it kind of, it helps understand that there's no one emptiness that everything share. Like it's
Right.
all at least individual, like depending on the phenomena that you're studying, that you're looking at.
Yeah, that's right.
There's no one separate emptiness.
Right.
That kind of reconfirms, like logically kind of goes towards that.
That's right. So now he gets into the next section, explaining the meaning of the individual divisions, which has 3 points: conventional truths, ultimate truths, and the indication that the number of the two truths is definite. So in this text, first he's going to cover conventional truths. And so he's, on the bottom of this page he says, he's going to go through that, and he's going to analyze, do so by, first he's going to give the definition, explaining the meaning of the words, and they're 2 words, conventional and truth, right? So he's going to go through each word and explain what does it mean, and then how do they go together. Okay, so then he goes into, he quotes Chandrakirti's clear words at the top of 277. And he says, in clear words, 3 meanings for the word conventional are explained. And I wrote it down. The Sanskrit for conventional here is samvrti. So the word conventional. So he's saying, and the reason why I mentioned the Sanskrit is that, so here Chandrakirti is going to explain, because he was this Indian Buddhist, great Indian Buddhist scholar. So he's taking, he's going to explain, because it's quite interesting, right? This word convention, this is what I was getting at. The word conventional is an English word, right? Which actually doesn't contain, you'll see if we start to analyze what does samvrti mean, it doesn't, the word conventional English doesn't normally convey or contain all these layers of meaning. Does that make sense? Whereas this word samvrti apparently did, according to Chandrakirti, who was a Sanskrit scholar. So that's why this is kind of an important, this next section is going to be kind of important, because I think, let's see if I say it right, like, they had to choose an English word that's the best fit, but you'll see that we'll have to, so now from now on, after we read this section, we're going to have to, as we think about the word conventional, understand that it means all these things. Does that make sense? And then we're going to analyze analyze how it means them, or what do they really mean, which is, that's going to be a long section. But okay, so the 3 meanings of the word conventional according to Chandrakirti. One is a concealer of suchness, or concealers of suchness. And definitely the word conventional doesn't ordinarily carry the connotation. And what is suchness? Emptiness, right? So one meaning of conventional is that which conceals emptiness, right? Or that which conceals suchness, that which conceals the ultimate nature of a thing, right? Actually, and when I said, I'll just ask, like, this is why it becomes quite interesting, right? Earlier, I said, like, if you just leave it very simply and you say, well, conventional truths are like, ultimate truth is emptiness and conventional truth is everything else. If you just leave it at that, it's quite simple, right? But then when you start to go, well, actually, what does conventional mean? Now he's saying it, right? Conventional means, one level of meaning is that which conceals the ultimate nature, emptiness of a phenomenon. A second meaning is mutually dependent objects. Things which are mutually dependent. And a third meaning is, this translator says worldly designations, or some translators say worldly conventions. Worldly designations, worldly, what's the word? Conventions or designations So like how the world labels and discusses things, right?
So I was thinking about the word, the Sanskrit word that you mentioned. So it has two parts to it, sam and vritti. So if you just take the vritti, the latter part, means label. And sam means everybody agreed upon. Everybody agreed upon that level.
Which is probably closest to the third meaning then, isn't it? Worldly convention or worldly designation. And so Chandrakirti is saying it has these other, what's the word? Glosses, you know, like often we see in a, if you look in a dictionary, right, there are many times where a word has varied meanings. So I think if you look at what you just said, right, that would be closest to the third of these, which would be almost like a direct etymological meaning. And then Chandrakirti is saying that in the context of Buddhist or philosophical language, it has these two other additional meanings too.
I'm sorry, we could not hear what.
Oh, do you want to say it louder? You couldn't hear.
I was just translating the word sam vritti, right? So it has two syllables and it's sam, the first part, and vritti is the second part, right? In Sanskrit you always have, you know, it starts with just like, you know, prefixes sort of stuff. So sam is like the prefix to it, which means everybody agreed upon. And then vritti is for the label, like saying, we all agreed upon saying that's Dr. Lord, right? That's a label. That's a sam vritti.
A vocabulary question. I'm always trying to narrow in on the term suchness, and you could say emptiness, right, the ultimate nature, but I'm wondering, is it more, like we're good with appearance, right? No problem picking that one up. Is suchness more like the union of appearance and emptiness? Like what's actually going on, you know, whether you're tuned into it or not? Or can you just say it is just emptiness, is suchness?
Yeah, in this context, suchness would be emptiness, yeah. They would just be synonyms in this context, yeah. And now he says, the latter, meaning the last of those three meanings. He just makes a comment about the last. So the worldly designations or worldly conventions of the three meanings. He says that latter one, the latter are said to have the characteristics of objects of expression and the means of expression, knowers and object of knowledge and so forth, not just the subjective designations, that is consciousness and expressions. So what he's saying there is, when we talk about worldly designations, that last of the three meanings, he's just making a point. He's saying, if you're going to correctly understand what that one means, it's not just the words themselves. So he's saying expression and the means of expression, knowers and object of knowledge. So he's saying that includes both subject and object. Does that make sense? That last one where he says worldly designations, because one could take that to mean it's just word. It's only when you say worldly designations, right? Or as Rajiv said it, you know, the label everyone agreed upon. A person could take that to mean, well, it's just the words that definite. You know, that it would only be referring to words. He's saying, no, don't think that. It's not only the words; it's the words, and he says that it's both. He says different things actually, though, isn't it? He says one is. Here. He says the object of expression and the means of expression, right? So it would be both, like. It would be referring to Rajiv and the label Rajiv, right?
Written Rajiv, verbal Rajiv, all kind of expressions. Right?
Knowers and object of knowledge. So it would also be the person labeling, right? So in that sense, the mind that uses the label. It sort of refers to all those. Does that make sense? So it's not just referring to the word alone. He's just pointing that out because otherwise, the phrase, this label, I mean, that phrase, worldly designations, a person could read that and think, oh, it just means the word. But he's saying no, it means the word and the person. The mind labeling, and the object labeled also.
So basically all three layers are dependent origination. Basically. One would be a relativity part of it, and again the mind labeling it, imputing it, and so on and so forth. All three of it.
Yeah, but that's true. Well, actually, if you think about it, though, the second one seems to be getting at the second level of dependent origin, right? Like a mutual dependence.
Yep.
And then the last one seems to be getting at the merely labeled, the designation part.
Yep.
So now he's going to comment on the first meaning further. He says, in this regard, the convention, which is the concealing, and this is going to be the first one is the most is the one that he's going to talk about the most, let's put it that way, right? The concealer of emptiness or suchness. So in this regard, the convention which is the concealing consciousness, in whose perspective form and the like is posited as truly existent, is the first of the three. In fact, it is the ignorance superimposing on phenomena that they have their own inherently established identity which does not exist. This is because true establishment is in fact impossible, which is why the positing of objects as truly existent is in the mental perspective. In the mental perspective that does not apprehend true existence, there is no positing objects as truly existent. So what he's saying, right, this first one, the concealer of suchness, right, concealer of emptiness, which is going to be very important, what's the word? Like, meaning to this word, conventional. He's saying, so he's talking about now, what does that one mean, right, to say it's a concealer of emptiness? And what he's saying is, well, that's from a certain perspective, isn't it? There is, so from the perspective of an ordinary person who's under the, which is all of us, right? Ordinary people. Ordinary people means people who haven't seen it. By ordinary in this sense, it means people who haven't seen emptiness directly. Non-Arya. An Arya is somebody who's seen emptiness directly, who's realized emptiness directly and is on at least the path of seeing. In Buddhism, actually. It's interesting, isn't it? The Buddha said, I don't know if you, like, that's an interesting point too, isn't it? Because the Buddha said, in ancient India, right, Arya was like high caste, and that was actually the Buddha's way of undermining the caste system too, wasn't it? They used that word, right? Because he said, you all say noble, right, means born in a higher caste. He says, I don't use the word that way. He said, for me, noble means somebody who's seen reality directly. And if you haven't seen reality directly, you're not yet a noble being. So it's a very beautiful use of the word Arya. Right? And so it became then passed down through the whole Buddhist lineage that became the meaning of Arya. Somebody who's seen emptiness directly, who's entered the path of seeing, which is an exalted level of the path. But so here he's saying, so he's talking about an ordinary person who's not seen emptiness directly. And then he's saying for that person, right, when he says from the in whose perspective form and the like is posited as truly existent, right? So in other words, that person, whenever they see anything, they see it as truly existent and they believe it's truly existent, right? Does that make sense? Everything, all the time, right? Whatever they see, whether it's they're looking at themselves, they're looking at some object, they're looking at another person, they're looking at their own emotion, whatever it is they're looking at, they posit it. Their consciousness perceives it as if it were truly existent and then believes that false appearance. And so do you understand then, like for that person, like all the, what is conventional truth for that person? Everything they ever interact with, right? All the things they interact with are conventional truth objects, right? And what he's saying is, for that person, right, all those objects conceal, right, emptiness. Like, in other words, they can't see the emptiness of those things. So when they see their friend, right, like when they see a chair, when they see a table, when they see a cup, when they see anything, right, it's concealing the ultimate nature of that thing. Because the way they posit that phenomena is as if it's inherently existent.
So your mind makes your own world. Everybody's mind makes their own world.
That's true. And I'll make one more point before I take a question, because we're going to get more into this, but I just want to point this out now. Which is, I think, very interesting if you start to contemplate what he's saying. I'll just take the example of the cup, right? Just to give something that doesn't have any emotional resonance, particularly. And so when I look at the cup, I think the cup, I posit, I'll use his word. I posit that the cup truly exists right there, right, from its own side, inherently. And so actually, I posit, I don't ever use these words, but I'm actually positing the cup as an ultimate truth. It's ultimately true. It exists from its own side, really and independently. Right? So that's interesting, isn't it? Like, the cup is not an ultimate truth, is it? Cup, and so actually, it's an interesting point. I'm just going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but we're going to get into it in a minute. or no, yeah, gradually, is actually, I never perceive the cup as a conventional truth. I think the cup's ultimate truth. I think I'm an ultimate truth, right? In the sense from the perspective of ignorance, right? Ignorance grasps that the cup is ultimately existent, right? And myself is ultimately existent, and you is ultimately existent, right? And what he's saying here is that ignorance, grasping at things in that way, is concealing the actual nature of the cup, right? So first of all, it's concealing the ultimate nature of the cup. But for me, it's also even concealing that the cup is a conventional truth, because I think I wrongly believe that the cup's an ultimate truth, which it's not. Does that make sense? And that fact is forces me not to be able to even see what the cup's actual nature is. Does that make some sense? So in one sense, I never realized that the cup is a conventional truth, because I keep thinking it's an ultimate truth, which is the problem. That's really interesting, isn't it? So part of this, I'm just getting at the profundity of this point. He's making a very profound, Chandrakirti and Lama Tsongkhapa are making this very profound point that the conventional, right, means concealer of suchness, right? And part of the way it conceals is that we don't recognize it's just a convention. We think it's ultimate. Right? And by seeing the cup as if it's ultimately true, I fail to recognize that it's just that it's a mere convention, and that it's ultimate. And then I definitely don't perceive its ultimate nature, which is its emptiness. But part of this is that first definition, concealer of emptiness, is from the perspective of an ignorant, of a mind of ignorance, right? That's what he's saying here. In this regard, the convention, so I don't want to go back and read it again, now hopefully it'll make more sense, but this is what he says. In this regard, the convention, which is the concealing consciousness, right, that first definition, in whose perspective form and the like is positive, is truly existing, right? So he's saying that first one is from the perspective of ignorance, right? That ignorance conceives of things as if they're inherently existent, and therefore all these conventional phenomena, it conceives of them as if they're ultimate or inherently existent, and therefore it conceals their true nature. So that one is from the perspective of ignorance. That's just a very important point. Anyway, sorry, somebody had a question.
Well, I think you just answered my question, because the emptiness is in the cup, but the concealing's going on in my head. Is that in my mind?
Is there a cup, though?
The second part of what you said, I completely agree with, which is that the concealing is going on inside in our minds. Yeah, that I agree with.
Did I say it
But
wrong?
you said the emptiness is in the cup. What does that
The
mean?
emptiness, well, the cup,
Is the nature of
it's
it.
like length and width. The cup has emptiness until it ceases to conventionally exist. Am I saying it wrong? The cup.
You say the cup's nature is emptiness, right?
Yeah,
Is that what you're
yeah,
saying?
that's
Yeah.
what I mean.
You're saying, yeah, the cup's nature is emptiness. Yeah, that's right.
Yes,
And yeah, that's right. And the mind is
the concealing's going on.
concealing is going on from the perspective of one's own mind. That's right.
So, so in the three meanings of convention, like the third one, which is worldly designation, can I think of that then as also contributing to my concealing suchness? Can I think of it that way? The fact that I'm labeling something, just like that cup, just the mere fact that I'm labeling it conceals to me the suchness. So that's how I'm thinking of it. But can I think of it that way, or is that a valid way to think of it?
In this context, I guess I'll say, we'll get into this more later in the next page or two, but I guess one way I would say it is just, I'm not sure if this answers the question fully, but I'll just sort of say it, is worldly designations, right, or it gets close to this idea that it's, as you said, that it's labeled, right, that it exists in part. Actually, you're getting it in a way. The third level, when we think about dependent origination, right, one level of dependent origination is labeling, right? That things exist dependent upon the label. And I guess one point I'll make is that it's complicated, isn't it? Because in one way we have to contemplate that to understand emptiness, right? But really, Lama Tsongkhapa later points out, like, let's say this right, like, that we really only realize that after we've seen emptiness, actually. Like, in other words, once we've seen emptiness, then we recognize, actually, that everything exists by virtue of being labeled by the mind. You know, and that up until the time where we realize emptiness, we actually don't really realize, I mean, this third one is happening, but we don't really realize that it's happening. Or is that things exist as mere worldly designations. Up until that time, but on the other hand, I think what you're getting at is there a use in, if what you're asking is there a use in contemplating that in order to understand that things are empty, then yeah, there is a use in that. We don't really realize it until we realize emptiness. Then we can sort of really see how our mind does that. But I think is part of what you're asking is there a usefulness in sort of recognizing, in contemplating, oh wow, my mind is labeling based on an appearance. Is that kind of what you're asking, or is it more different? It's a little different than that.
Well, I partly, I think, kind of, I'm just trying to distinguish between these three, and I cannot distinguish it clearly as three entirely different things.
Oh, I see. One way of doing it, I think we'll get into it later more, but
Yeah.
one way of doing it is this, because this last paragraph we just did was pointing this out, that the concealer of suchness, right, is from the perspective of the mind of ignorance. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, like, from the perspective of the mind of ignorance, as I described, right, it's sort of seeing things as truly existent or inherently existent, that conceals their ultimate nature and so on.
Regardless of whether I'm labeling it or not.
That one isn't even thinking about labeling. Like that
Okay.
mind isn't
That's
necessarily
okay.
think about
I
labeling.
understand.
Whereas these second two actually are more about, it's interesting, the first one is from the perspective of ignorance. The second two, right, recognizing that things are mutually dependent and recognizing that they're just worldly designations, is, you could say, is the way somebody who's not seeing them from the perspective of ignorance would recognize them.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's one way of saying it, is that the first one is from the perspective of ignorance, whereas the second two could still be sustained when you are no longer looking from the perspective of ignorance. That's one way of thinking of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
So then he quotes the commentary to the middle way. It says, delusion is a concealer. Right? So he's getting, the concealer is right getting at that first definition. Delusion, meaning ignorance, right, is a concealer. For it obscures nature, meaning the ultimate nature of things, right? Its fabrications made them seem to be truly existent. And were called conventional truths by the capable one. Fabricated things he calls conventions. And actually, that's a very profound verse, again, by Chandrakirti, right? So let's go through it carefully. Again, we're going kind of slowly, but I think it's good because it's complicated, isn't it? It's subtle, these points. The first one is delusion, meaning ignorance, is a concealer, right? So that's saying, right, what we've been talking about, that because, and well, actually, it says here, it obscures nature, right? So whereas ignorance, right, conceals the ultimate nature, and how does it do so? In the next sentence, the next line, it says that its fabrications made to seem truly existent, right? So ignorance fabricates a false nature onto things, right? It projects, it fabricates, it makes up something false, which is inherent existence, right? Or true existence here. It's the same thing, same means, right? So by making up that fabrication and projecting it onto things, it obscures the actual nature of those things, right? That's the first half of this verse. Then the second half is, so that process, or that is called, were called conventional truths by the Buddha, right? And notice this, there's a subtle distinction here which we're going to get into, so I just want to point it out, and then we'll explain it in a minute. And fabricated things he called conventions. This is getting a little bit at Cynthia, your question just now, and my answer to it. Right? Notice the difference between conventional truths and conventions in those two lines, right? He says, we're called conventional truths by the Buddha, capable Buddha. And fabricated things he called conventions, not conventional truths, right? Why does he use the word conventional truths in the first half and conventions in the second? Let me see this right.
So the
first
first,
half-
one
oh,
is
go ahead.
ignorance, basically. So
Yeah, from the
ignorance is a conventional truth, we say. That's how I see it.
The way I would put it is this, is that from the perspective of ignorance, like the Buddha would look at ordinary beings, right, and say, from your perspective of ignorance, all those things you interact with are conventional truths, right, that obscure the ultimate nature. But then the last line where it says fabricate things are called conventions, is that for the Buddha, those things aren't truth, right? There is, ordinary people hold on to those things as if they were truly existent, right? Truths in that sense. The Buddha would call them mere conventions, because for the Buddha, he knows those aren't. So he would call them conventions, but not he wouldn't. But he's not using the word truth there, right? Because he knows they conceal. Does that make sense? So it's actually a subtle distinction linguistically that he's making in this one beautiful poetic verse. But you see that distinction there, where he says, so he's saying, when the Buddha looks at ordinary people doing this process of through delusion fabricating things and then therefore not seeing reality, he says, oh, those are like. The Buddha looks at ordinary beings and says, all those are your conventional truths. But then the Buddha, from the perspective of someone who's seen emptiness, those are mere conventions. They're not true in the way that you think they are, right? So, Paul, you have a comment.
Yeah, I'm a little confused there. It seems like he's saying he sees the emptiness of the conventional truths. And he's saying, is that how to look at the first part of that?
Say again, I'm not sure I understand. The first part of
It
which?
seems like he's saying the emptiness of the conventional truths are seen by the Buddha, and that's why he calls them conventional truths.
No, that's not what he's saying here. What he's saying is, because we're going to get into it in a minute, what he's saying, and Lama Tsongkhapa will explain it more. What the Buddha is actually saying there, and what Chandrakirti is saying there, is from the perspective of ignorant people, meaning ordinary people, not like all of us, not ignorant people in the sense of some other person, but ordinary people, ordinary ignorant people. All these different phenomena are conventional truths in the sense of we hold to them to be true, and that conceals their ultimate nature. But the Buddha knows they're not true in that way.
Kind of
Okay, well then good. That was the good. And then you had a comment there.
So I'll add two things. First one is kind of funny. When you're talking about Arya, I started laughing because I had named my cat Arya. And I know it's like about no, but I didn't really know. Like there's so many interpretations that go along with that, and to understand, okay, so that's the interpretation of, in this context, what
In
Arya
Buddhism,
means.
yeah.
I was laughing with that.
Yeah.
And on this topic, I mean, we are focusing on the definitions right now. And I felt like, of the three definitions, especially the first one seems to be a cyclic reference. Like you read section A, and references section B, and says section B reads section A. The reason being that, and I'm kind of trying to understand it a little deeper, but in defining conventional truth, it was almost like defining the unconventional, the ultimate truth, right? So in a way, like, is there a definition of ultimate truth coming up, or is it just a negation of the...
No, ultimate truth is coming after this section.
So that's the reason I feel like there's a cyclic reference, because it says it's the conventional truth covers the ultimate truth, and it's the cyclic nature that is kind of sometimes confusing, or in a way like it doesn't really help like analytically understanding the full definition, because it refers to something that is coming up in the next round, right?
That's right.
So that's was a little confusing.
Yeah, and it's easier to understand them as we keep going. You're right. It'll become easier and easier to understand as we understand what is the nature, what is the definition of ultimate truth,
Yeah.
and then because you see they're
So it
related.
depends
Yeah,
on the other definition too.
yeah, they're definitely related. That's the way to put it.
And it's not just simple negation.
Yeah. Say what you mean.
I mean, it's not just, you were talking about a set, right? It's either this, like a big set of phenomena, or one falls in under conventional truth and the other one falls into ultimate wisdom. And like when you define one, you define the other. It's not like that. You have to define both, but they can be cyclic reference to each other.
Because
Like
dependent.
when we're defining, when we're defining on conventional truth, we are not defining the ultimate. Right? But the definition uses the ultimate truth as a part of its definition as well.
Yeah, that's true. Yep. Right, because even the word suchness is already implying the ultimate truth. You're right. Yeah. So we say, if we say the conventional truth with the first meaning, right? The conventional truth is that which conceals suchness. Well, suchness is the ultimate truth. Yeah. So it's you're right. Yeah, they're connected very much in that way. And you can't even linguistically, right? They're using the word for the ultimate in order to define one of the three parts. One of the three definitions of conventional, of the word conventional, is related to the ultimate. So you're right in that sense that they're interconnected definitions. So then, can we stop? Abandoning mistakes about this. That's good. So he quotes Chandrakirti's commentary in the middle way. In this way, conventional truths are posited for the time being under the power of afflicted ignorance, which is included in the limbs of cyclic existence, right? So there, he means ignorance, which is part of the cause of samsara. Cyclic existence is samsara, right? Ignorance is the first, he's talking about the 12 links of dependent origination, when he says limbs, 12 limbs or 12 links. So he's saying the very first limb of dependent origination that gives rise to suffering and samsara is ignorance. So he's saying, in this way, conventional truths are posited for the time being under the power of ignorance, which is the cause of samsara. So his first definition, he's saying, is from the, as I've been saying, is from the perspective of that ignorance. Now he's saying, he makes an interesting point. He says, for hearers, meaning like Shravakas, Hinayana people who have realized, solitary realizers, which are Prajeka Buddhas, and Bodhisattvas who have abandoned the afflictive ignorance and who see composed things as resembling the existence of mirror images and the like. They are fabricated natures rather than truths, because they do not exaggerate them as truly existing. To children, they are deceptive, but to others, meaning Aryas, they are mere conventions due to their interdependent arising, similar to that of illusions and the like. So what he, and this is, he's going to want to explain this quite a bit, but first of all, so you get what he's saying. So what the point he's making is he's saying, so in this, he's still focusing on the first definition, right? Conventional truth as a concealer of suchness, or concealer of emptiness. And so he's saying, one is, first point he made here is that is from the perspective of ignorance, right? So it's that, and that one uses that phrase, concealer, right? You have to have ignorance. Anyway, so for a person, and actually, if he's talking about, here he's talking about those who have removed, he's talking about, when he says, so he's talking about arhats, Prajeka Buddhas, and Bodhisattvas on the 8th bhumi or above. Those are all beings who don't have any ignorance. So he's saying, well, how about, so he's saying that first definition of conventional truth is from the perspective of ignorance, right? So then he raises this point, Chandrakirti lists these three kinds of beings, right? Arhats, Prajeka Buddhas, and Bodhisattvas who have eliminated all ignorance. And he says, one way you can say is, well, how about for them? Do they have a concealer? And how could, and if you think about it, pause for a moment and think about it. Well, how could they have a concealer? They don't have ignorance. Whereas ignorance fabricates a false nature and believes that false nature, right? Mm-hmm. How about for somebody who's eliminated ignorance? And so one point he's making is, well, they wouldn't, from their own perspective, one point I'll make, if you think about it, and then we'll go into what he actually says. From their own perspective, such a person wouldn't have a concealer, right? They're not fabricating and believing a false fabrication about things. So then he says, so for them, right? For them, when they look at that, they see them as fabric. Like, whereas if they look at how somebody else is, it's actually, there's that famous, we went over this in the, and he used the example of illusion, right? Remember we went over this in the section on illusion, where there's the analogy of like a magician is putting on a show, and then if like, what's there to say, right? The magician themselves doesn't, like the audience is like, wow, look, oh, that, there's a magical this and a magical that, but the magician knows those things aren't real, right? Because they're doing the trick, and so what he's saying here is going back to that. He's using a similar point here. He's saying, for such beings, they don't have those fabrications of believing all these appearances are true, right? So they don't conceal for those people in that way, right? And he says to children here are us, right? So he's saying, to children they are deceptive, right? To us, to ordinary beings, those are deceptive. But to these kind of special beings, these beings who have seen reality, they are mere conventionalities due to their interdependent arising, similar to that of illusions and the like, right? So he's saying for that person, that's like the magician, right? They see this display of appearances, but for them, it's not concealing. It's not deceptive, right? It doesn't deceive them. When they look at others, they can see, and actually you can see for that person, right? When they look at others, they would say, like, imagine being that person, right? Imagine you're at a magic show and you're watching people like react strongly, right? Like they're scared of the imaginal of a false appearance of a lion, right? Like, so you would look at them and you would know they're perceiving a lion as if it's going to hurt them, right? But you know it's fake, like a hologram. Let's say a holographic lion, right? Like, so on the one hand, you're not afraid of a holographic lion, right? But then you would say, like, how would you describe it, right? You would say, these other people, wow, look, they're having all these reactions. And what's there to say, right? Like, you would see, like, actually, you would say they're seeing a lion, right? And you would say, and they're not somehow able to see the actual nature of that lion, which is that it's a hologram, right? And so you would recognize they're not seeing the reality of it, and so they're having a reaction to that, right? So he's saying it's like that for these people, right? These aryas, actually they're arhats really. These arhats, when they look, and for them, right, he makes this point, he says, those things are mere conventionalities, right? They know they're not true. Does that make sense? For ordinary people, he says, they appear to be true, right? But for the arhat, or the Buddha, or the Bodhisattva rather, like he's describing, they're mere conventionalities. So let's continue on with this and we'll just make a couple more points, because now he says, this statement does not indicate. So he's going to clear up a couple of potential misunderstandings.
On the compositional factors here, is that the same one as the 5 aggregates?
Where does it say?
Basically the 8th bhumi and above, abandoned, afflictive, ignorance, and who see composed things. That's compositional factors, right?
I'm sorry, I'm just not seeing which line are you referring? Where it says solitary realized bodhisattvas who abandon afflictive ignorance? Of the quote, you mean?
Yeah.
So where it says solitary realized bodhisattvas who abandon the afflictive ignorance
And
and who see composed things as resembling. No, in that context, here's I see 327. So here's a footnote. Usually translated here as compositional factors.
What does that mean?
Here, let me just go back. Here, I think what that means is, what's the word, like, I think in this context, composed things would be, I mean, there he uses the word compositional factors, but I think here it's meaning things that arose due to causes and conditions. Like, so, I think it's like that. That's what I think it means there. So, like, they have abandoned ignorance and who see things that arise due to causes and conditions as resembling the existence of mirror images and the like. Yeah, so he's saying things that arose, like, so you could say produce things.
Produce.
Yeah, I think he's talking about produce things. I'm pretty sure.
So that's interesting, though, that there's three types of beings seeing things as they truly are, and yet the three types of beings.
Mhm.
Why aren't they all one type of beings at that point? Just from their motivation?
Yeah, the difference is motivation. Like the reality, their seeing of reality is not different because it's one reality. Emptiness is the same reality for each. From a Prasangika point of view, there's no difference in the reality. Their perception of reality is just the same reality. But the difference is their motivation, right? That for the Shravaka, their motivation is to liberate themselves from suffering,
Nirvana.
right? To achieve their own personal nirvana. For the Prajeka Buddha, it's similar, but they have this motivation to, they don't want to, they're kind of a solitary kind of person, and so they sort of practice to achieve, they do more things to create merit, I guess, but they want to realize that on their own, apart from a Buddha, like somewhere by themselves in a lifetime where they don't have a teacher in that life, they have a teacher in a previous life, whatever. And then for a Bodhisattva, of course, is to benefit all sentient beings, so, and to achieve enlightenment for all sentient beings. So the difference is their motivation. And then their, I guess the path is slightly different, right? Or somewhat different, right? Because the Bodhisattva then, because of their compassion, takes on the 6 perfections, generosity and ethics and patience and so on. All those trainings, the Bodhisattva takes those on in order to achieve that goal. But the key point is the goal, right? But then they do slightly different practices, or somewhat different, not just slightly. They do somewhat different practices in order to achieve each of their goals. But the reality they see is the same.
A little bit of a tangent, skip it. But what happens to say a Pratyeka Buddha between the time of their death and actually like knock time for compassion or whatever? Like, where are they hanging out if there's extinction?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So actually, I was just a couple weeks ago when I was up in Connecticut, Kent Rinpoche was addressing that point. It was kind of funny because he was pointing out that there are some of the there are different tenet systems in Buddhism, of course, and they have different views on that. So, like there are certain some of what we call like the lower certain Hinayana, or you call it, or whatever tenet systems say that the person is sort of extinguished and has no, like a lamp blown out or something of that sort. But the Prasangika school disagrees with that. It says no, that's not. They don't disappear. Their awareness, there is because they've eliminated ignorance. Ignorance is the cause of suffering, so they've eliminated suffering. But actually, this is what Kent Rinpoche was teaching prominent logic, and epistemology, and he was saying, but consciousness, the cause of consciousness is not ignorance. The cause of consciousness is a previous moment of consciousness. So consciousness goes on. So from a Prasangika perspective, they would say that person doesn't become completely non-existent because awareness continues, which is how the Buddha can come knock, as you said. And so, I guess somebody asked Kent Rinpoche that question, and he said that such a person, like a Prajeka Buddha, when they were alive on, say, in a certain place, and they achieved Prajeka Buddhahood in that lifetime. So he says that at the time of death, they would sort of, actually, I think he used the term, we kind of relate to what we were talking about earlier. He used the term Pure Land. He said that they would probably, that some scholars would say that they take rebirth in a kind of Buddha's Pure Land, and they abide in a state of meditative equipoise, free from suffering, for eons or something, until the Buddha of that Pure Land kind of would come to them and say, others are suffering, you have to help them.
Time to be a Bodhisattva.
Yeah, time to be a Bodhisattva. So that was the way Kent Rinpoche kind of, he said that's one, so that's usually the position, I guess, Mahayana takes. So then, about this quote, Lama Tsongkhapa says, he's saying, this statement does not indicate that whenever conventional truths are posited as existent, they are posited as existent due to ignorance. Right, so it's saying, one point is making is, if you think concealer of suchness, that is from the perspective of ignorance, then you can think, well, conventional truths are only an expression of ignorance. And he's saying that's not correct. That's one point. Does that make sense? And that's important, because sometimes people could think, if you think, well, conventional truth from the perspective of ignorance means it's that which conceals the ultimate nature, if you thought, well, that's the only meaning of conventional truth, then you can think, well, then they only exist from the perspective of ignorance, and then There's no conventional truth for a Buddha. That's ridiculous, right? That's not what he's saying. That's a wrong understanding. So don't think, just because we're saying one of the meanings of conventional is that which conceals emptiness, don't think that that means that conventional truths are only existent from a perspective of ignorance. That's one point. Then another point he's saying, nor does it indicate that in the perspective of the minds of hearers, solitary realizers, and bodhisattvas who have abandoned the affliction of ignorance, conventional truths are not posited. Right? So he's saying those people don't have any ignorance, right? So somebody might wrongly think, oh, therefore they have no conventional truth, or no convention, no conventional truth. And he's saying that's wrong also. That's not what this quote's saying. That's a wrong understanding. So he says, you can see how somebody could think that. If they just think of this first definition, that which conceals emptiness, and then you think, well, somebody who doesn't have ignorance, well, they wouldn't have that, right? So you can think then there's no conventional truth. He's saying that's wrong. So that'd be a misunderstanding. And now he's going to explain why. So why is the first of those 2 points, right, which is that it does not indicate that conventional truths are posited as existent, that they are posited existent only due to ignorance, or only due to ignorance. So he says, so the reason for that first point is, as explained earlier, afflictive ignorance is the apprehension of true existence, which is why the object it apprehends does not even exist conventionally. Whatever is a conventional truth necessarily does exist conventionally. Therefore, if something is conventional in the sense of a basis for positing phenomena as conventionally existent, it must be something that is not taken as conventional with regard to afflicted ignorance. So, what's he saying? Right? What he's saying is a couple of things. He's saying a number of things here. So remember I said, what he's trying to get at is some people, right, would wrongly have this idea. Well, if conventional means that which conceals emptiness, then conventional truths only exist because of ignorance. They don't really, they don't exist at all, really, except for just from some ignorant perspective. And he's saying that's not correct. And he's giving a couple of reasons. One is he's saying, one point he's making is he's saying, first of all, ignorance projects, or he's making a couple points. One is ignorance fabricates a false nature onto things, right? And he's saying that false nature doesn't exist at all. It doesn't exist ultimately, and it also doesn't exist even conventionally. It's just a fabrication, right? It's made up. And he's saying, so one point he's making is whatever is conventional, and he's saying whatever is a conventional truth does exist conventionally, right? But that other thing doesn't exist. The false nature that ignorance projects doesn't even exist conventionally. So he's saying that's an important distinction, right? So conventional truth objects do exist conventionally. And then ignorance projects onto them something that's false, that's non-existent at all. And so he's saying, therefore, if something is conventional in the sense of a basis for positing a phenomenon as conventionally existent, it must be something that is not taken as conventional with regard to ignorance. So there, what he's saying is, he's making it's pretty subtle, I think. What he's saying is, on the one hand, conventional truth objects exist, are existent phenomena. Right? And if all that conventional truth, so he's saying this first reason is wrong, the reason why this first one is wrong is, if you thought conventional truth objects only exist from the perspective of ignorance, well, ignorance is making something, first of all, ignorance is making something up and projecting it onto a conventional truth object, right? So that false thing that you're projecting on, that's not existent, right? But you're projecting it onto an existent thing, which is the conventional truth, the mere conventional, the mere conventionality. That's one point he's making. And then he's saying also, let's see, the reason is afflictive ignorance is the apprehension of true existence, which is why the object that apprehends does not even exist conventionally, right? And so that's an important distinction, right? What's being projected doesn't even exist conventionally, but there is a conventionally existent thing, right?
So, Dr. Lawrence, so the use case would be very simple, like my awareness, a valid mind, would know a good neighbor from a bad neighbor, A good neighbor is a good neighbor, a bad neighbor is a bad neighbor. It's a convention that exists.
Yeah, that's true.
Very simply put.
And part of what he's getting at, so I'll make this last point, I'll use your example to make it. Right, he says, it must be something that is not taken as conventional with regard to afflicted ignorance, right? So what that means is, on the one hand, Rajiv, you're getting at, in a way, the worldly designation part of it, right? But part of what he's saying here is, and it's actually true, isn't it? Like, in other words, if you think of your own experience, that the mind of ignorance doesn't see it as just a convention, right? In other words, when you have a bad neighbor, let's use the example of a bad neighbor, right? Somebody who's very difficult to be, obnoxious and rude and loud and so on. Like, you don't see that as a mere convention. Our mind, or the mind of ignorance, what's the word? Conceives of that as if they're truly a bad neighbor, right? From their own side inherently, not merely labeled by my mind, made up by my mind. But that's not the experience we have, right? Especially if it's a neighbor we really think is bad, right? Then we're conceiving of that neighbor as if they're inherently existent as a bad neighbor, right? And what he's saying, if you look at it from this perspective, is, one is he's saying, so we're taking, he's making our points there. This is why I want to slow down and really make this last one. What he's saying, one point he's making is, the mind of the mind of innate ignorance doesn't see that as conventional. It sees it as ultimate, right? And the fact that it sees that, let's say that, it is, so let's use the example of bad neighbor, right? The fact that the mind of ignorance sees that or conceives of that as ultimately true is concealing, first of all, that it's empty of inherent existence, but it's even concealing that it's just a conventionality, right? We don't even see that, actually, because we think, our mind conceives of it as if they're really a bad neighbor from their own side inherently.
Yeah, but Dr. Lauren, in my example, I was saying more towards a good neighbor is a good neighbor, a bad neighbor is a bad neighbor. It's a conventional truth. But then, under affliction, under ignorance, I would misjudge or get I would get deceived to think a good neighbor as a bad neighbor and a bad neighbor as a good neighbor too. So
say more of that last part. I'm not sure I understood the last part of what you said.
Sometimes we tend to get deceived under ignorance. Our awareness is, our valid mind is.
Oh, you mean you're talking about like somebody who has a bad neighbor, but they think they're a good neighbor.
Yeah,
it could be that.
It could be that scenario too.
Yeah.
So, but what I'm trying to say is, as a convention, a good neighbor will be a good neighbor. A bad neighbor would be a bad neighbor. Do you have the awareness, a valid mind that can look at that convention?
Oh, I see what you're getting at. Yeah, well, and
this was more like towards that, where it says, it does exist. A good is a good, a bad is a bad. A virtue is a virtue, non-virtue is a non-virtue, even conventionally speaking. Black, white, or mixed sort of thing.
This, I see where you're going with that, and what you're saying has a point. It's true, but I'm trying to say this the right way, like to say it accurately. First of all, later in the text we'll get into those kind of distinctions, and in other words, so what if you're getting at a valid conventional cognition?
This is not talking about that.
This section is not really talking about that exactly. Yeah, that'll come up later in the text. Actually, what you're getting at. This is more getting at something more. What's the word? More fundamental than that, or more basic? Maybe is the way to say it. More basic than that, which is.
Is it, say, the example of the rope and the snake? Like, if I see a snake and I cannot recognize that it's actually a rope, and that really does not exist. Is that kind of closer? Or?
Yeah. So what this is getting at, in a way, to use your the example of the rope and the snake, right? That's interesting. I'm just pausing. I mean, yes, what you're saying is true, and yet that even I was pausing because that analogy is ordinarily used from the Kent Rinpoche pointed this out when he was teaching the Majjhimaka Avatara. That analogy is more often used by the Svatandrika Majjhimakas, not the Prasangika Majjhimakas, for a particular reason, which we can get into. But okay, if I use that example anyway, because like, yeah, so afflicted, like, so you could say like, it's interesting from, like, I'll use that analogy, right? So let's say there's a coiled, it's like dusk, there's a coiled rope, and the person is walking, and they think it's a snake, and they jump, right? So you could say, like, if somebody else is looking at that, right, they could say, from the perspective of ignorance, right, so there was at a moment, that person's consciousness was believing there was a snake, right, which is the perspective of ignorance that we've been getting at. And that ignorance was concealing, using this thing, right, that there's no snake there at all, right? There's absolutely no snake there. Never was a snake there, never will be a snake there, right? So in one sense, that analogy can get at the idea of a concealer, right? That they're projecting of a snake, which is non-existent, conceals the reality, which is that there's no snake, right? Now here what he's saying also though is, later, right, if the person were to say, it's quite subtle, isn't it? Like, there was, though, so say this right, I'm trying to get it in the right way, it's very subtle, so I'm trying to get it in the right, say it in the right way. There was an appearance for that person that led to a reaction of jumping, right? And part of what he's analyzing in a way, you could say, is how does that appearance, what's the nature of that appearance? That's part of what that's one way of saying, what are we analyzing here? Because in other words, we can all accept, right? There was a projection, it was concealing the reality, which is that there's no snake. That's very clear. So that in terms of the concealer part, that's very straightforward, I think. This is getting at a very tricky part, though, which is like, in what way, like, there are conventionalities, right? There are appearances. And I'll just read the last thing because I know we're running out of time, but I'll read just the next paragraph. I'm just going to read a little section because I think it helps answer this question, where he says, he's talking about now the Arhat. Now he's talking about the Arhat or the Pratyeka Buddha or the Bodhisattva. So this is the person who's seen, using that analogy, this is the person who's seen there's no snake, right? This person knows there's no snake, right? So that's the tricky part. How do they posit that still there's not, that doesn't mean, so well, I'll read what he says, okay? So he says, the reason for the second point, meaning that, what's the second point? I'll just say it again. That from the perspective of those realized beings who have abandoned afflictive ignorance, that there's no such thing as conventional truth. He's saying that's not the case. And so why? And here he says, those who abandon ignorance, essentially, right, do not have the conventionality of adherence to true existence, in whose perspective true existence is positive, right? So those people don't project a snake, right? Then he's saying, that is the reason why composed things, meaning dependently arisen things, or also produced things, that is the reason why composed things are established as untrue in their perspective, but it is not established that they are not conventional truths. Consequently, the statement that in their perspective composed things are mere conventions means that for them, among the two components, conventional truth and truth, truth cannot be posited. So the word mere eliminates truth, but not conventional truth. the intention of so anyway. So we're going to go. I'm gonna leave out with that. We'll come back to it next time. But I just want to point something out. What he's saying there, just to briefly say, is so using your analogy, right? That for the person who has ignorance, it's clear, right? That's totally obvious, right? They're projecting snake. There's no snake. It's concealing the reality, and so on. But then he's saying for the person later, right? In other words, they know that conventional truths aren't true, in one sense, right? There's no snake. They know that. But, he says, how does he use it? He says, but they do still talk about mere conventionalities, right? And we're going to get into more what does that mean next time. So, because I think it's a very complicated topic. But that's what he's getting at here, is like, he's getting at a very subtle point, right? Which is, first, we get this idea of truth as a concealer. Hopefully people got that today. There's how for the mind of ignorance, this projection of true existence conceals the nature of reality. And that's one meaning of conventional, right? Or conventional truth from that perspective. But here he's getting at, so you have to, it's a very important point that, we're not saying, though, that to a Buddha, there's no conventional truth, right? But we are saying that from a Buddhist perspective, there's no conventional truth that conceals something, right? Because Buddha doesn't have ignorance. That part of conventional truth is from the perspective of ignorance. A Buddha or a great bodhisattvas and arhats, they don't have ignorance, so they're not doing that part of conventional truth in the sense of it's something that conceals something. They don't have that. All ignorant beings still have that, but they don't have that. But now he's saying, but some people think this though, that therefore for a Buddha there is no conventionality. He's saying that's wrong. Buddhas can still talk about mere conventionality, right? That's what you're saying, or mere conventional truth. But they don't take conventional truth to be actual truth, right? In the sense of reflecting reality. So we're going to get into how can that be next time. It's very subtle, but you see where we're going. So I'm just using that to get your analogy about the snake. That's the subtle part that he's getting at next.
This is very interesting. I think it kind of points out to thinking about the extremities. And the first time I kind of joined this, we were talking about jumping off a cliff. That was another discussion. But I think that's kind of what it's trying to avoid here. If I understand it correctly, is that, just because you are not ignorant doesn't mean that the conventional truth or the physical world doesn't exist. Right? If you live in this world, like you can believe you can die, you can be tired, you need to eat, you need to rest, right? So those kind of functions still exist, and you are not. It's not trying to refute the reality. So I think that's kind of middle way. Like, is that
that's exactly
middle
right.
way as well?
Yeah,
like,
he's trying to
don't
protect.
think too much. Don't think to the extremes. That just because you're not ignorant, the conventionalities don't exist.
Yeah, that's right. He's trying to protect us from falling. That's class. So you were here.
Yeah.
He was the phrase that with one of the extremes of falling off the cliff was the extreme of nihilism.
Yeah.
And here he's protecting against that one.
Yeah.
Where he says, so if you were to think, oh, that's all only from perspective of ignorance, it's not real. It has no reality at all. It has no conventional existence at all. Let's put it that way. Better way to say it. If you were to say it has no conventional existence at all, you would be falling into the extreme of nihilism. And here he's trying to protect against that extreme. That's right.
They're related then,
Exactly, yeah. This is getting at a kind of, and what you can see he's doing here is he's getting at the same point, but now he's doing it in a very, I think just in a very, using this language of conventional ultimate truth, and really, using that language to look at that even in more detail. That's, I think, what that's one way of describing it, is he's using this language of what is the conventional truth, what is ultimate truth. In order to get it, how do you avoid that extreme? You got it very well in that previous section, but here he's getting at some very subtle distinctions of how do you understand how does the conventional exist in the face of emptiness? Because it's difficult to understand the harmony of those two, of ultimate, and it's difficult to conceive of how does the ultimate and the conventional, how do they exist as different isolates with one entity, and how are they in harmony? How do they both, in a way, both have what's the word? That both are the nature of phenomena. One is the conventional nature, and the other is the ultimate nature of phenomena. So he's trying to analyze in more detail how do they coexist, how are they in harmony, in order to fully understand that point from earlier. Yeah, so it's not different; it's the same point, but just he's using this language to kind of get at some details about that. That's right. Do our dedication. The supreme jewel Bodhichitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.